Good morning, good afternoon.
Good evening, bonjour.
I'm the editor for the French media, The Conversation France, and I'm very happy to introduce this webinar on land use and sustainability. Before we start, just a little point and remark. We're going to conduct this webinar in two different languages, French and English. So please, you can click on the interpretation button at the top, at the bottom of your screen and decide if you want to follow in French and English, and then you turn down the sounds from the audio version of, that you don't want to listen to. So thank you for that. Indeed, this is a unique opportunity, I think, because we have this webinar because two territories very, very far apart, one in California, the Santa Clara Valley, the other one in Paris or around Paris, the plateau Paris-Saclay, decided to share a vision, to share information, and to try to work towards a common goal in terms of addressing the issues of biodiversity, of environment, in terms of land use, in terms of urbanization. And I think we have to thank the Santa Clara Open Space Authority and Terre to basically to be able to be here and to have worked on that webinar. This is actually a series of webinars. We had an introductory webinar back in January, and that you can actually still see on the YouTube channel from the Université Paris-Saclay. And this webinar also is on YouTube channel, so you can watch it as well. And there's going to be another webinar, which is on November 18th, on the issue of carbon and how we can control more and deal with carbon emissions and so on. So that webinar also will be there on November 18th at the same time, 6 p.m. French time. And we thank our friends in California for waking up early because it's 9 a.m. there. So that's part of this series. And again, today, happy to discuss those issues. In terms of the way we're going to conduct this webinar, please interact with us. You can ask questions on the chat channel. We're going to have students asking questions as well from the master clues, from Paris-Saclay. So please don't hesitate. Ask your questions on the chat channel. We're going to select some questions. I'm going to read them, and we can interact and discuss. This is really, about having a discussion and about, reacting to all those issues we're going to deal with today. For now, I think we have something very special. We have three special guests that we're going to start with that are going to give us, the general views and all the, the elements of the discussion. And then we're going to move to our friends from California, our friends from the French side, to discuss those two case studies I mentioned before. So let me introduce first, and I don't think you need much introduction, Mr. Yann ARTHUS-BERTRAND, the very famous French photographer, director, and environmentalist, has been fighting all his life for environment and biodiversity. Yann ARTHUS-BERTRAND, thank you so much for being here. And I think you can tell us in French, I think, where you're speaking from.
Yann?
Well, as a matter of fact, I had a meeting with the Prime Minister this morning to discuss the environment. So he asked to sit around the table and meet with me. And so if my Zoom screen says Prime Minister, of course, it's not me, it's just where I am.
You want to discuss a very special project of yours that resonate with the issue today.
Non, ce que je voulais dire, c'est que je suis un photographe.
Well, what I wanted to say is that I'm a photographer. I flew over the entire planet for years. I made a lot of movies. I'm sure you've heard about them. I recorded the beauty of the world and of nature, and I'm very active to protect the environment. And I also work on educating the general population. But with COVID lockdowns, it was impossible for me to take the plane, especially because of Greta Thunberg. She made me change my mind. I took the plane too much. Therefore, I decided to focus on France. And with my family, we just bought a plot of 30 acres to work on biodiversity here in France. And on these 30 hectares, we are working with our students, and the students found about 350 species, completely beautiful species, insects, animals. We set up cameras all over the plot, and I discovered a lot of animals I didn't even know existed. And we have another program called Vivant, and so everyone recording something in France can send us their pictures. And 160 people already sent us 360 hours of recorded animals. For example, martinet birds, I did not know that they would fly over for about 3 years without stopping. So a lot of very interesting recordings. And the more I discover about a new species, I've realized that I don't know anything about biodiversity around me in France. And to tell you the truth, it is fascinating. Furthermore, I also read your newspaper every day, every morning.
It means basically that you don't have to travel to the end of the world to be able to do what you have to do in terms of biodiversity.
Non, je vais travailler.
Indeed. I will be working at home in France, and all my projects, cinema, pictures, will be centered here in France. We're shooting another movie called France, Histoire d'amour, and a second movie on refugees with several teams. And we're also trying to work with local teams in order to prevent sending people at the other side of the planet. As I said, we are trying to reduce our carbon footprint as much as possible.
That time, I mean, we know where you are in the Prime Minister's office. So thank you again, Yann, and see you very, very soon. Merci. Merci. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Anne Larigauderie. You're the Executive Secretary of the IPBE, the Intergovernmental Platform Biodiversity and Ecosystems. And I think you're going to address all those global challenges that we face. Dr. Larigauderie, please.
Thank you very much, and greetings to all colleagues and friends around the world. I really truly welcome your invitation today. First of all, because the work that is done by Terre, Cite, and its partners relate very much to the work that IBES does. I really strongly feel that we are part of the same continuum, and we are together in this. And also because on a more personal note, I lived in one place, the Plateau de Saclay, when I'm not in the UN in Bonn, and I have lived in the other place at Davis, California. So I'm also very genuinely interested in those two partners and two sides of the world. So I have brought with me today 3 slides, and if I could have the first one, please. I hope that everyone has heard at least a little bit, especially the students, about IBES. So that would be the next one, which is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Next, please. And so IBES produces reports which summarize the available scientific knowledge as well as the knowledge from indigenous people and local communities relating to biodiversity, to the contributions that it provides to nature. And it provides all of these reports in response to governments and to other stakeholders. And that's really very important, that it is request driven, that governments are really part of this story. There are currently 140 governments who are members of IBES. So you see here quickly on this slide, the landmark global assessment that came out in 2019, and then more recently a report, nope, the previous one still, I'll say next when we move. The workshop report that looked at the links between biodiversity and the emergence of diseases and pandemics in particular, and another workshop report, so not an assessment, but a smaller report on the interlinkages between biodiversity and climate change, so really at the heart of what we're talking about today, and also the first ever collaboration between IBES and IPCC. So next, and to come to our topic today, land use. So land use really sit at the core of the issues related to biodiversity loss, to climate change, and also of the interactions between biodiversity and climate change. So there are 3 points that I would like to make. The first one is that land use is the primary driver of terrestrial biodiversity loss. Land use relating to deforestation, to agriculture. I would think that everyone would be aware of this in this audience, and also that land use is a major contributor to climate change. Now, the IBES IPCC report concluded in particular that there are land-based approaches which contribute to both biodiversity protection and climate change mitigation and adaptation, and that relates to avoiding the loss and degradation of ecosystems, particularly those that are rich in carbon and in species, the so-called nature-based solution, but also really investing, shifting towards sustainable agriculture and forestry practices, and also restoring ecosystems that are rich in carbon and in species. All of these are win-win solutions, those nature-based solutions. However, there are also some land-based approaches to climate mitigation and adaptation that can have negative impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And we're talking in particular about the ongoing deployment of some bioenergy crops. And we know that in some cases they compete for land with natural ecosystems, they threaten biodiversity, and they should be avoided. So what to do? And that's my next and last slide for this short introduction here. One of the perhaps strongest conclusions of the IBES global assessment was that nature can be conserved, restored, used sustainably while meeting all of our other development goals, but that in order to do this, we need what IBES refers to as transformative change. And I believe that this is what you are going to talk about at this webinar in the context of land use. So what that entails in particular is bringing together some innovative governance approaches. We're talking about being more integrative, bringing coherence across government sectors, placing biodiversity loss, climate change, their interactions at the core of all of these other development goals, as you see on this figure here. When we talk about health, when we talk about food, when we talk about climate, we should at the same time think about how they relate to biodiversity, to climate change, and to their interactions. We need to learn how to include a broader range of actors, to listen to multiple values and knowledge systems, as IBES does, since we work with science and indigenous and local knowledge as well, and to also think about sharing more equitably the benefits from biodiversity. We need to lean more on knowledge, on science. That is what we call informed governance. And we also need to move more towards adaptive governance. And that means really learning how to learn from experience, also enable locally tailored choices, promote public awareness, and as well as public access to information. So I will stop here. It's just really a few minutes to whet our appetite for what is up next. I hope that I have set the scene to introduce that webinar today, and I look forward to the exchanges. So thank you very much for your attention for now.
Well, thank you so much for your time and this very precious message. I would retain your optimism and the fact that if we do transformative actions and if we work on it, on the governmental level, but also between nations, then something could be done. And that's, I think, for the young generations, a very positive message. So thank you for that, and thank you again. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Norris. Thank you so much. Hello from California. Good morning. Yes. And so, Dr. Norris, you are Deputy Secretary at the California Natural Resources Agency, and in charge of biodiversity and habitat. And you're going to tell us, I think, the way this leading role as California has taken over those issues. Please.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is an incredible conversation. I'm really proud to be part of it across the Atlantic, and to hear about what you're doing in France. Yes, so California is really taking an exciting and aggressive stance on the need to address climate change and protect biodiversity. And I'm really proud to be part of this administration and have this opportunity to do something positive. And I feel like Anne gave my whole talk. All the points that she made are really in line with what we're trying to accomplish here in California. So our governor signed an executive order, which essentially tells the government, these are things we want you to do. Prioritizing nature-based solutions for California, both in our approach to climate change, as well as making sure that biodiversity conservation is a priority. And as part of that executive order, we made the commitment to conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. Last I checked, 72 countries have signed on to that pledge, including the United States, and California is a subnational that's part of that broader effort. And we're really excited to be taking that on. So our 30 by 30 goal includes sort of three co-objectives, which are, protecting biodiversity at its core, obviously, but then using our lands to sequester carbon and increase our resilience to the effects of climate change, and also improving recreation and equitable access to nature for all of California. And these pieces, as Anne just laid out beautifully, they really all go together and they complement each other. And so it's an opportunity to be proactive about conserving our lands to promote sustainability. Our approach to 30 by 30 has been incredibly inclusive. We've done 9 months of public meetings all over webinars like these, workshops, conversations about equity and climate change and what does it even mean to conserve, asking people how conservation works in their part of the world. It's been a really interesting and inspiring 9 months. Thousands and thousands of people across California have shown their excitement for this movement, and they want to be part of it and help us make it happen. We are gathering up all of this information into our strategic document, which is I'm in the middle of finalizing right now. So we hope to have that out for public review very soon, and that will set the stage for our collaborative partnerships moving forward, identifying really where we have opportunities to do more conservation together, what some of those obstacles might be that we need to overcome, and sort of what are the best approaches that we should elevate and invest in. Another sort of exciting piece of news is, despite all the crazy things going on with our economy, California actually ended up with a fairly substantial budget surplus this year. And that meant that this summer, we had an opportunity to invest in some high priority actions. We set aside $15 billion for the California Natural Resources Agency, which was over and above our normal $15 billion budget. So essentially doubled our budget. And of that, by my count, about $1.5 billion will support this nature-based solutions effort. So there's a set aside of, these numbers aren't important, but $750 million toward just nature-based solutions in 30 by 30. But we're also investing in coastal resilience, habitat restoration, and wildlife corridors and fish passage. So really looking at knitting together landscapes and investing in protecting our biodiversity and resilience. I'm not mentioning in that budget money that Virginia Jameson might have in her program to invest in agricultural sustainability and those programs, but hopefully she can touch on those as well. And I see those as part of the the larger story about how we do conservation in California. And this really is my last point, which is what's exciting to me is the inclusive approach that we're taking, not just to 30 by 30, but to nature-based solutions across California. We really recognize that conservation can occur across a wide variety of landscapes, you know, from wilderness to working lands. And many of the conservation practices in our agricultural spaces are critically important to protecting our biodiversity and essential in the fight against climate change. So our next round of speakers can absolutely talk to that much better than I can. I will just share one thing on my morning walk. There was a local radio program that said that there was a recent survey of the counties right around our state capital. And something like 90% of the people said, yes, we want more wild spaces and we want more agricultural spaces protected. And so that gave me inspiration for this talk. All of us are part of something really important and valuable. And I think the moment is now. People really recognize that this is important and worth doing. And so kudos to all of you for this conversation and for all the important things that you do. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Norris. And it gives us all a reason to go on morning walks every day. So please all do. And I mean, I would also, this budget of 50 billion to be, I mean, honestly, it's amazing seeing from the French side. I think, you know, you made some envious people on this side of the pound, honestly, because it's amazing. This is time for questions. And as I said, please ask your questions to the chat channel. We're going to relay them. I'm going to start. I have one question. I want to use something that Dr. Norris said to ask a question to Dr. Larry-Gaudry, if possible. Dr. Norris, you mentioned the enthusiasm of Californians and citizens. And I think it's something that is very, very important. And I wanted to ask Dr. Larry-Gaudry, I mean, how is that important? The fact that not only government, nations, or even intergovernmental platforms are doing something, but they are supported by the citizens of each country and of the world, I would say. Or is this important?
Well, it is fundamental because governments can point the way, they can provide a framework, they can, you know, set a level playing field by voting some laws. But then the bulk of the action really has to come from a diversity of actors. It has to come from citizens, from city planners, from farmers, from young people, from businesses. Very importantly, we are actually embarking upon a new report on how to help businesses also implement and do better in terms of their biodiversity impact. So it's not going to be governments alone. They are important, but equally important is the diversity of non-governmental actors, and what we do really also tries to reach out and to define options for action by them as well.
Thank you so much. So we see that we can all do something, and I think that's something that should be said here at the very beginning, because it's a common, you know, effort that we have to produce here. I'm very happy now to introduce, as I said, students that have some questions, and I'm going to introduce Loan, who is the representative students for the master clues in the Université Paris-Saclay. Loan, please ask your questions to Dr. Norris or Dr. Larry-Gaudry, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for your speeches. So my question was that the IPBES reports revealed the 5 biggest pressure on biodiversity, which are the result of indirect factors such as economic activity or social habits, demographic evolution. So do you consider that giving an economic value to ecosystem services is efficient, even if this means saving biodiversity by including it in a capitalist model and having a productivist view of biodiversity?
Shall I go ahead and address the question directly? Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you, Loan, for the question. It's clearly an important concept. Do you know that currently IPBES is in the last stages of preparation of a report on the multiple values of biodiversity? So my response would be just that. Economic valuation is one way to value biodiversity, but it should by no means be the only way, and that there are many other aspects of biodiversity, such as the intrinsic value of biodiversity. And that is extremely fundamental, particularly to the IBES approach, but to many of the experts around the world. And so that is why it's important to not exclude that economic valuation. It's very useful in some circles, but to never forget that there are other values as well when we think about biodiversity.
Luan, would you have another question, maybe for Dr. Norris?
Alexis will ask the question.
Yeah, you talk about protection, and you know that land use changes have been one of the most important driver of lost diversity. And so does land artificialization will bring agricultural land gain on the wildland?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand just the last part of what you asked. Could you say it again?
Does the land artificialize on agricultural land will gain on wildland? So the old agricultural land will gain on wildland, others, or protect wildland or things like that?
Well, I think we see conservation as on sort of a continuum, right? So there's the opportunity to protect lands close into urban areas. The Santa Clara folks are doing that really well. But then within our agricultural spaces, actually a lot of, in California, at least in the Central Valley, we have a lot of remnant vernal pool landscape, these ephemeral wetlands, and they coexist with grazing very effectively. So a lot of our conservation of biodiversity happens on rangelands. And then, you know, we transition into more of our wildlands that are further away. And so it's part of a matrix of what we're protecting. And I think depending on what your goals are, you would focus on a different aspect of that.
Dr. Norris, before I think we can take another student question from the students, but I have another one. I was wondering, we know that California, as we said before, is taking a leading role on those issues. What's the situation in other parts of America in terms of other states? I mean, could you a few comments on that, because it's obviously important to see everybody on the same boat.
I've been trying to track other states that are making the commitment. New Mexico actually just made a 30 by 30 commitment. Hawaii has one, mostly for its marine waters. I believe Colorado is exploring it, but then obviously there's the national Biden administration overall, America the Beautiful. And they have a similar set of priorities and sort of core values about, you know, really promoting conservation across a wide variety of landscapes, focusing on voluntary conservation. You know, we have lots of laws in California and the United States that limit, you know, effects to species and that manage growth for better or worse. But this approach is really designed to be sort of in the positive, incentive-based and voluntary and collaborative. And that is really happening across the country, including with the approach the Biden administration is taking.
We have, I think, another question for the students, and I have actually also a question from the people listening. So let's try to do it quickly, but I think we can squeeze in those two questions. Students, no more. So let me read a question that comes from the listeners here. A question I would really be interested in is how actors can be supported in concretely handling apparent conflicts between climate impact and biodiversity protection at their scale, and in identifying and maximizing synergies between the two. But that may be a bit of a Pandora box for this format. So, which is a question that that is legitimate. Obviously, is how do you reconcile apparent conflict between all those stakeholders?
Well, I think we always have conflicts. We're asking land to do more and more. We're asking all these places to do multiple things. But I think what ecologists can do is help people understand that you can't actually have a functioning planet without all the plants and animals that occupy it. One thing I like to say is that the ocean produces oxygen, but it's not the salt water. It's all the organisms that live in it, right? So we need to build the connections in people's minds that ecosystem services aren't just abstractions. They actually rely on healthy biodiversity that has enough adaptive potential to respond to the changes that climate change is bringing us, right? So we can't just assume that what we have now is good enough. We need to be preserving our biodiversity for the future, because those are the building blocks of these systems that we rely on, that sustain human life. It is not something happening out there. It is part of what makes this planet work. And I think we need to do a better job of telling that story. And I don't know if you want to contradict that, but I think it's what you were saying.
No, I totally agree with that. But, again, I mean, some people are just, asking themselves, okay, how can we be efficient? And being efficient means, taking care of those conflicts. We're about to go to the second part of this presentation. I would like again to thank our special guests for taking the time, for being here, for taking the time to exchange and to have those discussions with students and also with us. So thank you again, Dr. Norris, thank you again, Dr. Darigolui, and thank you, Yann, even if he's talking to the Prime Minister at the moment, so he's gone. Thank you again. So the second part is really that what we mentioned at the beginning is looking at, case studies, I would say, in California and France, and sometimes there are similarities we're going to see. Sometimes there's differences, but obviously there's a will there on both sides to work on those issues. And I'm very, very, very happy to welcome Virginia Jameson from the Department of Conservation in California. Good morning to you.
Hi, good morning and good evening to you. Thank you so very much for having me. My name is Virginia Jameson. I'm the manager for the Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation Program, which we call SALC for short. As I said, I work for the California Department of Conservation, which is a department under the Natural Resources Agency, where Dr. Norris is Deputy Secretary, and which is responsible, and the department is responsible for balancing today's needs with tomorrow's obligations by fostering the wise use of conservation of energy, land, and mineral resources. And so to Dr. Norris's question about how much money we have this year for farmland conservation, it's really exciting. We have 50 million to spend, and then another 50 million that will include habitat restoration on farmlands going out of production, and other ecological improvements. So Jennifer mentioned the 30 by 30 executive order, and one of the components of that executive order is the protection of what we call broadly working lands, which includes farmlands, grazing lands, generally agricultural lands. And 30 by 30 doesn't separate out agricultural and natural lands. So I'm going to tell you about one of the programs, the SALC program, that will contribute to this goal. And so it's a little bit interesting because the SALC program is actually a sub-program of the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, which is run by the California Strategic Growth Council. And the Strategic Growth Council is made up of members of the governor's cabinet, which works together to coordinate investment programs and initiatives that make it easier for Californians to walk, bike, and use transit. You may know that personal vehicle use is one of the most significant contributors of greenhouse gas emissions in California, which means that reducing the number of vehicle miles traveled is crucial to meeting our climate goals. The Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program is designed to create housing that's transit-oriented, and to date, that program has awarded $1.1 billion to 104 projects consisting of 9,000 housing units that provide housing close to jobs and transit. 70% of this funding has gone to disadvantaged communities, and it's estimated that the program has resulted in over 2 million tons of CO2 equivalent removed over the course of those operating lives of those buildings. So you might be wondering how agricultural land fits into this. Well, the idea is that agricultural land conservation is the other side of the coin from compact development. So if your goal is to make sure that development doesn't sprawl, it's complementary to invest in creating both higher density urban areas and permanent protection of the land outside those areas. So in that way, you avoid the increases in greenhouse gas emissions that accompany new development that's sprawled out onto farmlands. So the SALC program ultimately funds two types of projects. We do planning projects that are carried out by cities, counties, and other land use related agencies. And then we do acquisition projects, which include either the outright purchase of particular pieces of farmland to permanently conserve it, or the purchase of conservation easements, which are deeds that prohibit development on a particular piece of land. And then we also offer small grants to our easement grantees that provide money for them to create environmental management plans so that they can design strategies for saving water, reducing pesticides, and improving soils. So next slide, please. So you might be wondering, let's see, is that the right slide? It's checking. Well, I'll go on anyway. I'm on the second slide, the overview of the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program. So you might wonder how the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program came to be part of a housing program. And basically, California has a long history of NGOs like the American Farmland Trust, the California Climate and Agriculture Network, the California Alliance with Family Farmers, and others who have long made the case that in order to protect farmland, you need to prevent sprawl development, and that planning for housing near transit and jobs is complementary to farmland conservation. So back in 2014, when California's cap and trade program was being set up, those advocates lobbied the Strategic Growth Council and the legislature to include language in the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program statute that the program would reduce greenhouse gas emissions through projects that implement land use, housing, transportation, and agricultural land practices to support infill and compact development. There were members of the Strategic Growth Council who were very familiar with the background research and the connection between farmland loss and sprawl, and so they worked to make it a priority. And at first, when the housing portion of the program was developed, it was thought that farmland conservation projects would just be one of several project types that applicants could choose from. But then it was decided that if conservation projects had to compete against housing projects, housing may always win. So it was decided that the agricultural lands should get their own sub-program, which was then named the Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation Program. So this is where the Department of Conservation comes in. That's where I work. And that's because the department had a long history of running agricultural land conservation grant programs, and it was judged that the department was best suited to carry out that work. So in the first round of the program in 2014, the council allocated $5 million from the total that the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Project program was given, and that was given to SALC. So those same advocates who had understood that it was just important to protect individual properties understood that funding planning to ensure that overall community plans incorporated the conservation of farmland into their long-term planning was vital. So, however, the California Air Resources Board, which is another agency at the state of California and which runs the cap and trade funding program, needed evidence that farmland conservation planning and easement projects were connected to greenhouse gas emissions and that doing these projects would result in emissions benefits. So that's where the work of the next speaker, Dr. Louise Jackson, comes into play, and she'll tell you more about that research. But basically, the advocacy community was able to draw the council staff's attention to her research. And then based on that, the Air Resources Board was able to develop a quantification methodology that we now use to quantify the estimated emissions avoided each time we do a farmland conservation project. Sorry. Once the Air Resources Board was reassured that their funds would be used in a way that would reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions, the legislature passed a bill that said that starting in 2015, the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program would receive a continuous appropriation of 20% of the total cap and trade funds, also known as the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund in the state. and that then the Strategic Growth Council took action to allot 10% of that to SALC. So now we have a program that protects farmland, measures avoided emissions, and as far as I know, we're the only program doing this in the United States or the world. And of course, these farmland projects also have a lot of other co-benefits, which include protecting wildlife habitat, protecting the interface between wild and urban areas, buffering communities from fire, and ensuring our food supply into the future. So I think that all this work was basically made possible by having an advocacy community that had been informing key decision makers about the connections between these issues for a long time, so that when the opportunity arose, the decision makers could make the case that smart growth and conservation are connected. And then that was turned into what is going on in the legislature, and that was prepared to, and they were prepared to present the research to the agencies who needed it to make the case that there was a connection between the funding source, which is greenhouse gas based, and these programs. Next slide, please. So the impact of it all has been tremendous. In the last 6 years, the program has been able to award $232 million in grants to protect specific properties, and for planning grants that enable communities to bring together different jurisdictions and stakeholders to create a shared vision, which sets up future actions beyond protecting specific properties, so that communities have a plan for where they want to grow and how, and what they want to protect and where. So I don't expect you to see this map in a lot of detail, but you can see the round dots that are green protecting our 123 acquisition projects, protecting specific farms, and the 24 squares that represent planning grants in communities across the state. So in total, we've protected over 117,000 acres of farmland, avoided an estimated 15 billion vehicle miles traveled, or 7 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. But other than that, we've created a reliable, consistent source of funding for this work, so that grantees know they can rely on money existing to do projects next year. And that would not have happened without the contributions of the advocacy and the research communities. So I think I'll stop there, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Virginia. I mean, all I wanted to say is we have a lot of questions coming in, which I think is a good sign. But I'm going to tell, we're going to wait until those three guests from the Californian side, intervene, and then they can answer all those questions whenever they want to, take them. I have my WhatsApp, because my questions are coming to the chat, and WhatsApp is bombarding me with questions, so which is good news. So my pleasure now to introduce Louise Jackson, and from UC Davis, and Louise is going to emphasize the importance of research and the way the role research plays in all of those issues. And please, Louise, I'll let you introduce yourself and also talk about the study you've been and your research you've been conducted. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. I'm an emerita professor and cooperative extension specialist at UC Davis. And today I'm going to be telling you about a case study on climate change mitigation and adaptation in an agricultural county in California. It was done a few years ago. So this was funded by the state of California, the California Climate Change Assessments. And what they were interested in was the vulnerability of agriculture due to the projections for heat and drought in the future. They came to UC Davis and they ended up organizing a team that addressed their specific question, which was to do a regional case study that addressed a lot of different issues around this topic. We went to our local county, Yolo County, and we got some enthusiasm, and the administrator there delegated us to work with different departments and programs. So Yolo County isn't an agricultural county, and there's just small rural cities, but those cities are expanding. So it gave us this opportunity to look at urbanization. So as the study evolved, more and more people got involved. There were collaborators, NGOs, as the ones that Virginia Jameson mentioned, organizations, farm advisors, consultants, And we began collecting data and got a lot of input from what I'd call local advisors, the farmers, the ranchers, a technical committee, workshops, public meetings. And it ended up with a lot of outreach, not only in reports and articles, but presentations to the government and to the public. Next slide, please. So we took an interdisciplinary and participatory landscape approach. And the questions asked by these entities were somewhat different. The state was mainly interested in agricultural vulnerability as part of their sort of emerging set of ideas around natural and working lands as climate solutions. The county wanted a local climate action plan that was relevant to their land use and populations. And for us academics, we wanted to figure out how we could even study options for land use and sustainability under climate uncertainty. So the study involved biological, physical, and social sciences and had a lot of different methods going on. One was a tier 1 inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. We did a scenario analysis of agroecological processes. We did hydrologic modeling, household surveys, historical trends in crops and climate, and a land use model. So as far as the studied interventions, one that Virginia just mentioned was the ability to look at greenhouse gas emissions reductions. What could be done? Most of the work, though, was focused on new crops and practices, increasing biodiversity and renewable inputs, water use efficient technologies, and diversification of high value crops. But what we found was that at that time, especially, farmers were skeptical that climate change was even occurring. And that meant that some of these ideas might be slow to take on. Another important issue that Virginia described really nicely is that we wanted to know was where in the county could there be densification and compact growth, and how could that affect energy use and land conservation? So there were a number of types of reports. Scientific reports vetted and approved by state government and therefore more relevant to policy, a local planning document for the county's use that they created that was mainly on greenhouse gas emissions, and articles in scientific journals on environmental management and climate change. Next slide, please. This study was how we obtained the greenhouse gas emissions data that's been mentioned. We looked across all croplands and rangelands in the county, and we looked at the practices of conventional management. And what the most number one source of emissions was direct nitrous oxide from soil fertilizers. Next was mobile farm equipment. But at the same time that we were doing that, municipal and industrial emissions were being calculated by the county consultants. And they found that urban land uses were much higher in greenhouse gas emissions than cropland emissions. In fact, urban land use has 70 times higher greenhouse gas emissions per acre than cropland, and rangeland was even more dramatic. So the outcome was that protecting agricultural land from urban development is essential if the county is to stabilize and reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. And this was the data that went into the SALC program that was just described. Next slide. The study also focused on vulnerability of agriculture and natural lands. One example is shown here. Across the entire county, we looked at maps of geomorphology, landforms, and soils. And what we call Region 2 was recent alluvial soils that support irrigated crop production. And you can see that this 100,000 hectares is excellent to good in soil quality. So these are really promising soils. But in fact, tomato and wheat, only 2 crops, occupied 50% of the land area, and walnut and almonds, more high cash value crops, only occupied 12%. And there were 25 other crops that were able to be grown here on a small percentage of the land. So one of the things we looked at was diversification. And actually diversification and agrobiodiversity are very well known to buffer against environmental stress. There's less widespread damage, for example, if there's a heat wave, if it's spread across more crops. Overall, our goal was to look at pathways to resilience. And on the right, there's a very cursory summary of what we found. First of all, there were a lot of new crops and practices that seemed viable and could be implemented, but it would require a change in attitudes amongst the farmers. That has been happening. There has been funding for from state programs on healthy soils, on water use efficiency, and that's one of the ways that we're getting farmers on board to see how they can be thinking about coping with climate change and maintaining their businesses. And as Virginia described very well, city infill growth was another priority that's beneficial not just for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but create a more sustainable agriculture. So together, these do have the opportunity to preserve natural and working lands. So I want to just end by thanking the many researchers and participants in this study, and to the stakeholders and policymakers who've used the results for climate solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. And again, stressing the importance of research and the way people can work together to obtain a goal. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Andrea McKenzie from the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority. Andrea, you're going to talk to us about what's happening on the ground from the Coyote Valley, which I think is one of the best names you can even give a valley ever. So the Coyote Valley, it's up to you.
Thank you, Fabrice. Good morning and good evening. I'm Andrea McKenzie. I'm the General Manager of the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority. And as Fabrice said, I'm really interested in showing how we can be integrating governmental policy, funding, and research to advance the pace and scale of conservation at both the regional and local levels. So the Open Space Authority is a regional public land conservation and stewardship agency. We protect an interconnected network of natural areas and agricultural lands in the Santa Clara Valley, just south of San Francisco. We're working to use nature-based solutions to address climate change on a local and regional scale. We've been around since 1993, and we've protected close to 30,000 acres of both natural and working lands in the region. Next slide, please. So I'd like to start off by showing you a regional context for our agricultural conservation work and how we are integrating considerations of climate change and biodiversity. So this map shows an approximately 44,000 acre agricultural resource area marked by the brown line, where remaining farmlands of what was once called the Valley of the Heart's Delight are located. We have urbanized cities of San Jose, Morgan Hill, and Gilroy that are shown in gray. And the farmland lost to development over the past 40 years is shown in red. The remaining farmland resource that we're trying to protect from development, including the Coyote Valley, which is a biodiversity hotspot and our highest conservation priority, is shown in green. So the context here is important because you can see the remaining agricultural lands are being squeezed by the growth of the cities of San Jose to the north and Morgan Hill to the south. We know cities want to grow. They want to make space for more housing, offices, and other commercial uses. And as we've heard, this is going on across California and of course many parts of the world, but it comes at a very high cost. We're losing about 50,000 acres or about 20,000 hectares of farmland every year in California, primarily to the growth of cities. We Americans like to measure things in football fields. And so that's 100 American football fields or 78 European football fields we're losing every single day. And in Santa Clara County, the same thing is happening. We've lost 45% of our prime farmlands to what we call sprawl in just the last 40 years. And you may not know that before before Silicon Valley, before houses and technology development over the last 40 plus years, the Santa Clara Valley was actually the largest fruit producing region in the world. And while just a fraction of this productive land is left, the Santa Clara Valley still has a vibrant agricultural economy that contributes over $1.6 billion to our local economy each year. And we know the trends in the loss of farmland to development have climate implications, and we've just heard this from Virginia and Louise. And you see on the right side of my slide here, the statistic that was informed by Dr. Jackson's research, that in Santa Clara Valley, an acre of farmland produces 77 times fewer greenhouse gases on average than developed land. So by protecting farmland and directing the growth into the cities, rather than outward onto productive farmland, we're maintaining ecosystem services, we're protecting biodiversity, we're providing food security, and we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that's why the state program, this Sustainable Ag Land Conservation Program that Virginia just described, is so important to us on the ground. Next slide, please. So just 5 years ago, the Open Space Authority received $200,000 in grants from the state's Strategic Growth Council and Department of Conservation to work with the Santa Clara County government to develop a comprehensive plan called the Santa Clara Valley Agricultural Plan. And the goal of that plan was to strategically protect agricultural land as a climate tool, a climate strategy. Since we completed this plan, we've also received over $8 million from Virginia's department for the protection of 157 acres of prime farmland, which includes both protection of conservation easements and outright purchase of land. And this plan has now become our roadmap for policy and strategic protection of remaining farmland, working lands in our region. The plan prioritizes areas for protection and acquisition. It recommends stronger land use policies that favor agriculture over development, and it supports voluntary ecosystem-based incentive programs. And this plan has become an important tool and strategy to slow the annexation of farmland to cities, which is really, really important if we are to stem the loss of biodiversity and our agricultural lands in these peri-urban areas. And that's what this juxtaposition of traffic jam on Highway 101 going through the Santa Clara Valley and the productive farmland on the right. I just want to mention also in this regard, in California, we have a very important agency called the Local Agency Formation Commission, or LAFCO. And their role is to decide how and where cities grow. And so cities must come to LAFCO to decide if they're going to absorb or annex more land. And LAFCO relied on this Santa Clara Valley Ag Plan funded by the state to limit the amount of farmland annexed to cities by development. So we're very, very proud of what this plan has been able to do. It's had a beneficial effect on decision makers in municipalities, deciding where and how growth will happen. And it's helped educate decision makers about the importance of agricultural viability and sustainability. What's happening now, real time, is this plan is being used by Santa Clara County as the basis for creating a climate change overlay in the Santa Clara County. So in November, the County Board of Supervisors will vote whether to adopt a climate change overlay to prioritize the protection of agricultural lands for their multiple benefits. So ecosystem benefits, groundwater recharge, biodiversity protection, flood management, of prioritizing those multiple benefits over residential development. So we have high hopes that the Board of Supervisors will adopt this, this new policy in November. Next slide, please. So you heard great presentations from our opening speakers, including Dr. Norris, about California's 30 by 30 goals. And they fit in very well with the SALC program, the state SALC program. And I don't think we ever envisioned we would be marrying these things, but we actually are now on the ground. And we're using farmland to help protect biodiversity in the region. And nowhere is this more evident than in the Coyote Valley, our highest landscape priority. Here, there's a growing body of research about wildlife use of agricultural land and how climate-friendly agricultural practices can allow us to prioritize lands with multiple benefits for local food production, climate mitigation and adaptation, and biodiversity. So what are you looking at here? You're looking at an aerial image of the Coyote Valley, and you see our friendly bobcat that resides in this area. And we fixed or put radio collars on 26 bobcats and followed their movements around the agricultural lands of the Coyote Valley. Each set of colored dots and lines on the map represents the movement of just one single bobcat. And as you can see, these bobcats and other wildlife are using this agricultural landscape as a movement corridor. And this has helped us build the case that we need to protect our peri-urban agricultural lands from warehouses, office buildings, and suburban sprawl. We've been tracking animal movements using wildlife cameras. And this is part of the applied research that's happening in the agricultural landscape to help us make the case of the multiple benefits of a landscape like Coyote Valley to nature and people. Other research that we're engaged in is looking at where water is recharging our local aquifer. So this agricultural landscape sits atop the drinking water supply of 1.6 million people. So we want to know how our agricultural lands are recharging our important aquifers, how wildlife and agriculture can coexist, and how we can capture more carbon in the soil. And so research has an important role here in our conservation efforts. And I might just add, with respect to carbon sequestration, we're working with researchers at the University of California, Berkeley. They have a Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment called the Climate Program, to develop a new carbon and ecosystem services credits program that we hope will be adopted by the city of San Jose and the county of Santa Clara. And this program would allow developers to purchase conservation credits in the places like the Coyote Valley to mitigate their environmental impacts within the urban areas. And so it's creating a bank of a revenue stream to increase conservation and restoration in this agricultural and natural working landscape. So I'll close by saying I really enjoyed hearing the previous speakers and really the emphasis on research, planning, funding, and integrated governmental policy. When we marry that together with on-the-ground conservation, we're really able to increase the pace and scale of nature-based solutions. And nowhere are we demonstrating that more than here in the Coyote Valley in the Silicon Valley area. And please go on to our website, openspaceauthority.org. You can learn more about our planning and conservation work and the ongoing research. So Fabrice, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. I do think this graph about the bobcats, movements is fascinating. And I mean, this is, thank you so much for those three speakers, from California. I think we had a kind of a global total view of what's happening there with the SOUL program and that Virginia talked about, with the importance of research that Louise addressed, and then the work on the ground from Andrea and in the Santa Clara Valley. As I said, I have a lot of questions, both in French and English. I'm going to try to do my best. One for you, Andrea. People kept, noticed you said, we need to protect land, we need to do this. And they said, what does that mean exactly, to protect land in California? Who is protecting? What does that entitle? Who are the stakeholders in there? Or how do you decide to protect that piece of land or the other? And how does that work?
Well, I'd be happy to take the next 5 hours to answer that question. That's a lifetime of work that we've all been up to. So as we heard from Jennifer Norris today, we are making informed decisions and we're deciding on trade-offs as a society. We believe that Our natural lands are supporting life on this planet. They're supporting economic productivity. They're supporting biodiversity. And so we make specific governmental decisions and monetary investments to back that up. Those aren't easy decisions, and those decisions happen at the state level. They happen at the local level. And in California, many decisions are made locally, and they're very controversial. And so the more we have research, bodies of research, and experts like Dr. Jackson, who are informing the studies that we're doing, the more we bring decision makers along, not only to make development decisions, but also to invest local funding and statewide funding in conservation. And we need to move beyond property by property wins. We need big scale wins at the state level and the national level. And that's where all of this, of what we're talking today, comes together.
Thank you so much. Before we go to the students and the questions coming from Loan and France, I'm going to join two questions for you, maybe Virginia. One of them is very direct. It's in English, but it sounds like a French question, which is, how is the SOLT program financed? Who is giving them money, basically? That's one thing. And the other one, which I think is interesting as well, is when you deal with companies, because you deal with companies, in terms of, urbanization, so how do you deal with them? Do you need do we need some laws to force companies to be part of that process, to have an environmental policy that can be part of those efforts? So two questions in one is the financing of the SOLT program, and how do you deal with companies in California that are not very interested in whatever you're doing and say, well, you know what, I'm not interested in that. Thank you very much.
Sure. Well, I think those questions are connected because we get the money for the program from the state's cap and trade program, which is funded by companies that are heavy polluters having to buy permits to continue to pollute. So the highest polluting companies are forced to contribute to that funding stream. And then as far as, maybe corporate agriculture or other companies like that, we have had them participate in our program, sometimes because they have an environmental mission as part of their corporation, or they have a financial incentive because we do pay for the development rights when we protect a piece of property. But to just go back to the question Andrea got, our projects are all voluntary. So we have voluntary landowners who come to us and ask for funding to protect their properties. So yes, corporations are voluntary participants sometimes, and they're also sometimes mandatory participants in providing the funding.
Thank you so much. Loan, are there any questions coming from your side?
Yes, and Leah is in
yes.
charge.
I'm going to ask the question. So thank you really much for your presentation, and congratulations for your project. I'm going to ask if it's possible to imagine the creation of a mechanism or policies to make the population consume the goods of the agriculture in these sites. It's to relocate the food to feed the population with the lands.
It's having local circuit, basically, which has been a big issue in France with the confinement and the lockdown that we. So how do you address that? I don't know who wants to answer.
Louise, you want to take that one?
I think this is a very interesting part of the multiple benefits of conserving land right in the peri-urban areas around both small cities and big cities. And there's growing interest in California on how we create smaller scale operations, ones that aren't so enormous that they tend to be monocultures. So there's a farm to fork movement in California. And there's food banks that also are involved. So this is something, as Fabrice just mentioned, that is coming out more with the lockdown, but it's already growing in interest. And there's a lot of interest among the students at UC Davis too, of how they actually become involved in various aspects of both the farming and marketing locally.
Fabrice, if I might, I'd like to just address that question, tell a short story. As we speak, that Coyote Valley landscape, which is all in agriculture still, I mean, historically, it's mostly been conventional farmers farming for export. And now those farmers, the last ones who haven't been bought out for conservation, are saying agriculture is dead. I can't farm, it's not viable, therefore I need to be allowed to develop. We have some small scale farmers who are growing produce for local markets, for restaurants, to multicultural markets. We're trying to stand them up because that's the new paradigm for that landscape, and we need that to get our multiple benefits. But we're in this tug of war right now between the old paradigm and the new paradigm. And so we're really trying to make sure through research and partnerships that we're procuring the food from these local landscapes for businesses, schools, hospitals, tech cafes and cafeterias, and that kind of thing. And it's very difficult to prove that economically, but that's the fight that we're in right now.
Thank you so much, Andrea. This is such an important point. Another question coming from the students. I have a nice one, but I'll wait to the end because it's an interesting one. Please, another one.
Yes. I had a question about the fact that the change in practices often result in a loss of production and decrease the yields, at least in the short term. So how do you evaluate and compensate the risks taken by the farmers? And have you considered or implemented some payment for ecosystem services?
Maybe Virginia on this one.
Well, we try to provide some funding for management plans so that farmers have resources to try to design and implement plans that conserve air, water, and soil, and reduce pesticide use. I think perhaps Louise could better speak to the decline in yields at first. I don't know much about that part. But we do try to provide incentives at the state level. And I know our Department of Food and Agriculture also has many grant programs that provide funding to help get those new practices off the ground related to healthy soils, water efficiency measures, methane digesters for dairies, stuff like that.
Louise, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just briefly. In the past 20, 30 years, we've seen much less propensity for transformative agricultural practices to cause initial losses. We have had a lot of research. We have farm advisors on board. There's a lot of communication amongst the different producers. So those losses are not nearly what they were when people were first embarking, say, on organic production. But the incentive programs provided, say, by Healthy Soils, the program, are super important. And so that it's not so much compensating people for losses, but giving them the funds they need to start it off right from the beginning.
Thank you so much. I'm going to squeeze in a very last question very quickly because we have to go to the French, presentation as well. There's a question about do all those programs affect housing prices, which I think is a legitimate question as well. I don't know who wants to answer that very quickly.
Well, our housing prices in the Silicon Valley are some, if not the highest in the country. And those decisions are not being made or are not affected so much by setting aside productive farmland and areas that have ecosystem services, because many of those lands shouldn't be developed anyway. They have wetlands, they have shallow groundwater tables and so on. But it's about efficient use of land within the cities themselves. And so as we speak, there are new laws in California that are saying that single family residential parcels shouldn't be the practice anymore, and that we should be putting higher density, multiple units on individual parcels, and encouraging investment in higher density, especially to benefit low income areas. So it's a false argument that our farmlands, our productive natural and working lands are our silver bullet to the housing crisis. That's just not the case.
Well, thank you so much for that. And again, thank you so much for the our guests from the Californian side. And it's time now to move to the French side, the other case study in some ways, the plateau Paris-Saclay. I'm very happy to introduce Paul Ridley. He's been working with Paris-Saclay for a long time, as a professor there. And I think he's going to give us some keys to the global challenges we face. Paul, it's up, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fabrice, very much. So I am a professor of ecology at Paris-Saclay University. But what I want to do is take a step back again and look at some of the work that's being done at the international level, looking at positive futures for biodiversity and people. And what you can see on this slide is work that the scientific community is doing, trying to imagine these positive futures. What you can see in this diagram is there's a historical trajectory of the state of biodiversity over time, and it's been declining. We know that. Lots of assessments have shown that, including the IPBES global assessment. And whenever we look at business as usual scenarios, it just keeps declining. And that's not a very pleasant future, not only in terms of the impacts on biodiversity, but also in terms of the services that it provides. So we're trying to imagine positive futures for biodiversity and people, and asking the kinds of transformations that we need in order to get there. And that's pictured in this bending the curve scenario, in which the state of biodiversity actually improves. Now, of course, we can't bring back extinct species, but we can increase the population size of threatened species. We can improve the integrity of ecosystems. And it is possible in quantitative terms to build realistic scenarios in which we can actually restore biodiversity. And what I want to talk to about is the kinds of things that we need to do that. So one of the things that we've talked a lot about here, like 30 by 30, which is conserving 30% of all land by 2030, is really important. Protecting land is really important. But we really need to not make the mistake that that's the only thing that we need to do. We really need to protect biodiversity everywhere, and we need to restore biodiversity where we've degraded it. So the restoration means that we need to go into those places where biodiversity has been degraded, in agricultural lands, in urban lands, and restore biodiversity there. But we also need to act on climate change and get as close to 1.5 degrees warming as we can, as is embodied in the Paris Climate Agreement. And even more importantly, outside of all those protected areas, we need to reduce pressures on biodiversity. And that means fundamentally changing the way that we produce and we consume. Next slide, please. So that work is actually partly fed into, or one of the things that is fed into the next set of goals that are going to be set internationally, called the Global Biodiversity Framework, that will be agreed upon in China, hopefully next year. And a number of targets have been set for 2030. And I think it's worth looking at those and thinking about how they can then be translated into local scales. So one of the first targets is a really interesting target, and that is that countries would agree that the entire planet should have spatial planning. We need to think ahead of time about what we want to do with our land. And especially in that, we want to make sure that we retain existing intact ecosystems, and wilderness. A second target is about restoration, and it's a very ambitious target. It's to restore 20% of degraded lands, and that's really important. We can't bend the curve. We can't start getting more biodiversity back unless we do restoration. The third target is the target that's already been talked about, which is protecting 30% of land and sea, an incredibly important target. But to that, we need to think about, and that was one of the questions that was asked by one of the students, what about these indirect drivers? Don't we need to address those? And that's one of the things that we've been doing with scenarios work, is to show that we absolutely have to address these indirect drivers of change. We need that the agricultural areas under forestry are managed sustainably, for example. Next slide, please. So one of the questions you might be asking is, what does all this work by IPBES or agreements that are reached in the Convention on Biological Diversity, what importance do they have for us at local scales, either in California or in France? And there are a number of important things. First of all, these agreements, these assessments really help provide awareness of the problem. Surprisingly, when the IPBES global assessment came out, many people didn't know that we were in a biodiversity crisis. You may all listening may know that, but many people didn't know that. Second of all, it provides context so that we all know that we're in this same situation. It's a problem that we're seeing just about everywhere in the planet. And another important thing is that the international agreements, like the Convention on Biological Diversity, governments commit voluntarily, admittedly, to adopt those agreements into national policy. And that national policy can, as Anna Argadari said, can then provide the conditions under which you can begin to implement sustainable development at local scales. What's really important here, and what's going to be talked about afterwards, is then local implementation. So it's really important that we take that into account. That's where you're getting creative solutions. We at Paris-Saclay are working very closely with local actors to go through co-conception of solutions. And one of the key things that we need to think about is how these really interesting, innovative things that are going on in California around San Jose, in Saclay around Paris, can actually then be scaled up to larger regional, national, and international scales. And that's really what we need to be thinking about. There's lots of great stuff going on. How do we get this so that it percolates back up to national and international levels? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I mean, I think it's very important to set up those, targets on a global level and to try to understand what work is, needs to be done. And there's a lot of work still left out there. It's my pleasure now to introduce Nicolas Cornet, and I pronounce it the French way, I'm sorry, and Damien Delaville, both from Paris Region Institute. And, we've talked about those global targets. I think Nicolas and Damien are going to talk to us about, what's happening in Europe, but also on a French level and in a regional level, in the region Île-de-France, where Paris-Saclay is situated. Please, up to you.
Bien. Très bien, bonjour, merci. Je m'appelle Nicolas Cornet.
Thank you very much. My name is Nicolas Cornet. I'm an ecology specialist in the French region, in the Paris Region Institute. And I'm going to tell you about our public policy report with my colleague here, Damien Delaville. Before starting the presentation, I would like to thank Paul for his very exhaustive presentation, as well as what he said last. Global actors need to be able to communicate with local actors, because we need to protect at least 30% of our lands and oceans. However, this happens at the expense of indigenous peoples, and these people have lived for generations and generations in nature, and their natural habitat is disappearing at an alarmingly fast rate. So it is clear we need to protect our lands. How do we see the situation? What we would suggest is to have an objective of zero net artificialization of land. So that is an ambitious challenge. And so this objective can be compared to the ERC approach, ERC, which means avoid, reduce, and compensate in French. And this approach was actually, we were inspired by our American friends for this approach. In Europe, in 2011, the European Commission drafted a roadmap for efficient utilization of resources. The overall principle is that the Earth boundaries, global boundaries, need to be respected. And what we suggest is that the preservation of the natural heritage allows for a global transformation of our economy. Then, in 2018, the French government adopted the so-called Diversity Plan for France. In 2018, this plan didn't have any binding value yet. Then in 2019, the region Île-de-France includes it in its biodiversity strategy. And recently, in August, this ZAN objective is now part of our legislation. Next slide, please.
L'objectif ZAN, en fait, consiste, comme pour la séquence ERC,
so ZAN is the following idea: to stabilize the level of artificialization of land remain stable. In other words, any piece of land that is used for non-agricultural activities need to be compensated by another plot of land which will be turned into an agricultural plot. In other words, to stabilize the quantity of non-artificial lands or plots. We very often talk about consumption of plots, of spaces, but this artificialization is a much broader concept. How do we define this? How do we define artificialization? We needed about 2 years to agree on a common definition. The question is, now that we do have this definition, how do we measure? How do we measure it? What would be the deadlines? What would be the objectives we want to achieve? Which are the soils which would be adapted to compensate the loss of other plots? Should we work at local, regional, national level? Other question: is it a good idea to always have this binary approach, that is artificial land and non-artificial land? Other question: how can we take into account the functionality of ecosystems? The idea is not to damage ecosystems, but it's very difficult to quantify. How do you know that you're not damaging them? Then, if we want to reinstate plots into their natural state, we have to assume that we still have available land to do so. Today, we assume that it is possible. But I'll get back to it. It's no easy task. Do we have these lands to compensate? Well, what we see is that on the one hand, we can use land, but on the other, we need other pieces of land to compensate the loss of the first one. So the question is it possible in France for local authorities to create solidarity between local authorities across the country? I simplified the definition of artificialization for the interpreter because it's very complex, but this is the gist. This would be the definition. To artificialize a soil means that if a soil is artificial, if the land use or the activity lastingly impacts its ecological functions, which means that farmlands and green soils are included. But the definition also adds, except agricultural lands and open grounds urban areas. And this is actually quite interesting, because if we had already urbanized all available land, this objective would be impossible to achieve. So in this case, we are protecting agricultural lands and natural plots to make sure that life remains possible, as we've seen in the previous presentations. Now, the so-called ERC approach. According to this approach, each ecological impact should be compensated. But then, after the adoption of this new program, we've noticed that this approach has failed. Why? Because its definition was unclear. The current definition of artificialization is very difficult to implement, and also the other reason for which ERC strategy failed is because we found out that it was impossible to compensate lost ecological functions. In other words, which means finding new soils, but we can't guarantee that there will be any available. So we need to keep preserving the soils and keep reinstate natural plots. We need to work on renaturation of plots. Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Nicholas, for this introduction on this ZAN strategy, Z-A-N. As he said, we've managed to define artificialization. But now we're up against the wall because we're not using all our tools that are available to us. We've started mapping these available soils. So today in France, more specifically in the north, in the region of Île-de-France, we have a tool called MOS, which allows us to follow land use over time. We started collecting data in 1980, and it allows us to analyze plot by plot, and we know whether it's urban, natural, agricultural, forest-based, and this is what you see here on the screen. About 24% of the spaces were forests, and the rest was agricultural. This allows us to monitor the spaces used by the urbanization, and what we see here is that urbanization has been ramping up for many years. As we can see, in the Île-de-France, in this small region, we already are lacking available soil because every year about 8.4 square kilometers become urbanized. And out of these, about 25% are linked to national projects. Furthermore, only 2.5 square kilometers are urban areas turned into natural areas. Therefore, if you analyze the soils, we have about 5.9 square kilometers net urbanized each year. So if we want to reach a neutral state, we are actually in a negative situation. We need to stabilize it, to give more space to nature and to urbanize less. Next slide, please. Climate and Resilience Law, which was voted on August the 22nd this year. And it sets out a roadmap for us to achieve our objective, our ZEN objective. And this in several phases. First, land consumption, because we are working here on tight deadlines, and today we don't have the necessary tools to monitor the artificialization of land. So we're still sticking to land consumption, and the objective between 2021 and 2031, the objective is to divide by 2 the urbanization rate. In France, we are at 8.4 square kilometers per year that are urbanized. The objective is to reach 4.2 between or by 2031. Furthermore, a national tool, the so-called OSES-GE, is also being developed. And this tool allows us to have a refined understanding of artificial lands. And our institute is also working on another mapping system, which will allow us to analyze each soils, which are the soils that are artificial and which are the ones that are not. This will include gardens. It'll allow us to make a distinction between parking lots, gardens, parks, and so on. These tools are being developed, and they will allow us to have a cleaner, more refined monitoring by 2031. And this leads us to phase 2. The phase 2 of this law. So between 2031 and 2050, the net artificialization should drop to 0 by 2050. In other words, a very ambitious plan. It will run over long and also short periods. That is until 2050. Now the question is, this climate and resilience law, how can we implement it at national level? How can we transpose it in our legislative framework? And next slide, please.
Donc, déjà un peu un briefing sur comment s'organise la planification et comment s'organise l'urbanisme.
What about planning and urban planning in France? 3 main scales. First, regional scale. In Île-de-France, we have a specific scale, the so-called SDRIF. And for the other regions, another scale is being applied, the so-called SRADET. It's a very hierarchical system. So the SDRIF or the SRADET scales prevail over the other local documents. And then you also have the PLU for local authorities. So SDRIF scale for Île-de-France, which means by 2023, which is around the corner, the SDRIF will have to include this climate and resilience law, as well as suggest a strategy, a long-term strategy to reach this 0 net objective. Therefore, the objective of this SDRIF scale is to create a regional philosophy to achieve this objective, as well as to define territorial balances wherever possible. And the idea is also to locate potential areas of land consumption in order to compensate the urbanization. And this will also be included in housing policies and so on. This policy will then have to be implemented at very local level, at municipality level by 2026, which means that all municipality documents will need to be updated to include this SDRIF objective, and they will in turn be implemented at municipal level. And this will allow to locate potential areas of land consumption, as well as to locate potential areas of renaturation. Then, The local scale, PLU, it will be updated in 2027 to be compliant with regional policies, and this is where the main challenge is. If you start at municipal level, here we will work on a very small scale, gardens, parking lots, agricultural lands, and so on. And we'll define the potential uses of these plots. We'll draw the zoning for the municipality. We'll define a minimum percentage of green spaces and permeable grounds. And this should allow us to find the right balance between urban areas and green areas. In other words, if I build a house on a green space, a compensation will have to be found. An entire system which needs to be set up for this local policy to function. And elected officials will receive tools in order to take the right decisions.
Thank you so much for Damien and Nicolas for addressing this very interesting and important issue of artificialization, even if it's not easy to say, and also the role of policies on a regional and national level. Before introducing our last guest, please, I just wanted to let you know, don't hesitate to ask questions towards our French guest, and then we're going to open the floor to discussions to everybody. So that's, please send your questions. And it's my pleasure to introduce our last guest on the French side, Caroline Doucerin, who's the president of Terre, Cite, and Julie Tissot, who is part of the EPA from Paris-Saclay. Please, it's up to you.
Oui, bonjour, mais l'introduction est faite par Madame Doucerin.
Effectivement, bonsoir à tous. Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for being here today. The group has just explained that ZeroNet is something that is undergoing. It is not implemented yet operationally. But thanks to the mobilization of the local actors, we have an example of protection of the natural spaces that could be interesting for the future. The context is different, of course, because many acres have been withdrawn from agriculture for the development of scientific aspect. But this can lead and add to the debate. Today, we have new lands close to Paris, so the urbanization started alongside the railway, as you can see on the left side of your screen. After the Second World War, many research centers started working in this region, so along the railway. In the 70s, we started seeing a new urbanization on the left side of your map on the right. So this was a new city, and it was extended to the Saclay Plateau, even if there were many critiques. But we can see that it's kept evolving, and the farmers were against it because they were fearing for their ability to stay on their lands and to be able to fight these urbanization projects. So this is why the farmers went out and discussed with other farmers and created Terre Cite in 2001. And quite quickly we understood that farming was very important for the plateau, because it gives a context in a livelihood that is very comfortable. So the local actors, stakeholders, started launching new projects and diversifying the farms on the plateau. With the failure of the initiatives launched in 2006, the government decided on a new project. Because of the mobilization of the local actors, Grand Paris launched a new law to urbanize croplands, but with compensation, a guarantee on the sustainability of the other lands, the remaining lands. For example, we had the natural parks that gave us the example that preserving lands just doesn't work if you do not have other activities that include the local stakeholders. So Paris decided on new projects without saying what were the sources of financing. So there was a team that was implemented to support this project that could accompany the evolution of farming on the territory, and new actions were implemented quite quickly. Thanks to the Ministry for Agriculture, there was a program that from the European Union, the LEADER program, that funded Terre, Cite. LEADER, this program, also gave us a common platform for dialogue. And together, people every 3 months decided on which project had to be funded. With this group, the projet alimentaire, so the project for food, was created to really have a farm-to-fork project. Starting in 2013, new meetings between the researcher and the people working on the land were created. So this created really the participative aspect of this, with the research and the university working on climate change. So now I will give the floor to Julie Tussaud to give us more explanation in the role of the state in this planning. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm CSR and Sustainable Development Director. So I will talk to you about this project of Paris-Saclay for the urban planning of Paris. So this was a center for research on development. There were major challenges, so the government decided to create an operation for national interest. The objective was to create a technological cluster, a renowned one, and also to make this territory sustainable. So this is part of the region of Paris, and the planning project was trying to urbanize the region around the stations. So this green area is a protection zone created by the law in 2010. This law, this Grand Paris law, creates a new development authority that has to coordinate and manage the urban project, and that creates this protection zone, this protection area for the forests and green areas. And this is done with the public authority for planning. And this is the same group that is working on the suburban transport. This now was part of a decree for 2,469 hectares, which are 5,000 acres, more or less. Next slide, please. So this is a unique tool, really. It was created by a law, by a decree. We did not talk about this decree because it is not a document that is linked to public planning, but it is there to protect from urbanization this area. So thanks to this tool, we were able to stop the land grabbing on the croplands that would happen in the 80s, 90s, up until the 2010. So this territory has to evolve. It has activities, it has roles to play on the ecosystem. So there was a charter implemented with a governance program and a set of actions that were proposed to relay a list exactly of 28 actions. So there was a committee to pilot the program. We have 22 pilots to this program that are coordinated on a daily basis in order to secure the future of working lands, secure the future of natural spaces, but also develop links between the land, the project, and the inhabitants, and also the cluster, the research cluster, and help the transition, the ecological transition. These action programs will go on up until 2023, and next year we will start working on the next action program, which will also be engraved in adapting to climate change, and of course on resilience. Next slide. So a few examples of the actions that we are leading. On the left, you can see an action that is registering all the farms in the plateau of Saclay in order really to create a relationship between the consumers and the local producers. In the middle, you have an observatory for birds in Saclay. It's quite recent. It's there to observe and to watch biodiversity on this lake. And last picture, you can see a new path, a new pathway that can lead you to this protected region in order to promote the walks and also biking between the region and the protected area. So I finished, and I will give the floor back to Clara and Bertrand to conclude. So thank you, Julie. So as I said earlier, it's not enough to protect an area to make it efficient. So Directrice is working on the continuity of farming, and in particular in the interface with the urban region. There are roads that are not proper to the farming equipment. There's also the question of agricultural continuity and metro. We were able to get the trust of the farmers, and we were able then to create a project, and these projects were not possible in the past, and now they involve the majority of the farms on the territory. So this is a project that was successful, but now we have to think about the future and find the way to finance the project that have the possibility to be a success, really. There is still a lot of work to do, of course, as Julie was saying before. And for the years to come, we will have to discuss on this.
We say in French, which is more work to be done, obviously. I'm just going to give a few questions, take a few questions really on the French address to the French guests before we try to kind of summarize this webinar and open the floor to a broader discussion. There's a lot of questions about the ZAN project, and one of them is Paris-Saclay under the ZAN program? And I think Mrs. Bertrand already answered partially, but I think we need to be a bit more clearer about when is the ZAN program starting, who's going to be part of it. And then there's another question which is linked to that as well, which is asking, and I think those two questions might be for Nicolas and Damien, is the objective of 2050 ambitious enough in terms of artificialization of the land? So please, Nicolas and Damien, maybe more precisions in terms of the program itself and the ambition of 2050.
Alors, Question, pour la dernière question.
All right, last question. I don't think I'm allowed to answer it because I have my personal opinion, but what we need to look at is the IPCC's report, and its conclusion is very clear. We are now, it is time to act. The 2050 scenario, well, 2050 is far, but also around the corner. I don't know whether it's too late, but this will depend on our capacity to renaturate, and this is information that I don't have. Now, the other question, when and who? So the law is very clear. We've just discussed this. And who? Everybody. Everybody needs to be an actor of change. Everybody has its own responsibilities. It's of utter importance to involve citizens, but it won't work if national authorities don't set binding rules. So we are all parts of this challenge, which we need to take up all together. And as Damien said, we need to adopt a more qualitative approach. And the IPBES report is very clear. We have a lot of data, and the situation is very clear. But in my opinion, whether we'll succeed or not to achieve this ZAN objective, it's whether we are pragmatic. Here, humanity's future is at stake. And let us now realize how urgent the hour is. And maybe we should also add something that we haven't heard about enough. We talked about climate, about biodiversity, but we haven't talked about health. And protecting biodiversity will guarantee a future, a healthy future. And we are part of this biodiversity. So let's act for us, and this will also be good for the climate and for biodiversity. And I would also like to add that if this ZAN objective succeeds in 2050, it depends on how well it is accepted by citizens. Because its impacts will be strong on the way we live, the way we travel, the way we go from point A to point B in cities. Because this will lead to a densification of housing, and these impacts need to be accepted by citizens. What's more, in order to make sure that this is accepted, would be a much stronger renaturation of urban areas, that is, more green areas accessible to everybody, close to their homes. So this densification cannot happen on its own. It needs to be associated with other initiatives, more green spaces, more small shops, more corner stores, to increase the life quality of everyone.
Do you have any questions coming from the students?
Yes, I had one question. Sorry, I put my video on. So yes, some studies state that it takes more than 10 years for land that has been artificialized to become fertile. Do you think converting urbanized or artificialized land into agricultural lands could be a solution, or renature through reforestation is more efficient?
We want to answer that.
So I can take a shot at that. So that's absolutely true, and it's one of the biggest problems with the avoid, reduce, and compensate. The compensate part of it's really, really hard. So if you destroy agricultural land or you destroy natural vegetation by urbanizing it, it's really difficult to restore land that has been previously artificialized. And so it's really important when you're thinking about the ZAN or any of these things that are no net loss, that you think about what actually you're going to get when you compensate. And it's way better to avoid and reduce than it is to compensate.
Well, there's actually a lot of questions about compensations. I mean, people are asking, are compensations enough in terms of what's happening on those programs?
So what we know, we published a paper in Science last year that reviewed some of these issues, and particularly because the Convention on Biological Diversity had a no net loss goal. And a meta-analysis of data has shown that roughly 2/3 of no net loss programs that have been investigated don't result in no net loss. So there's a huge problem with the way that they're being implemented. And there are a number of issues with that implementation. One is related to the question that Loan just asked. Another one is compensating what with what. And one of the biggest problems is it's frequently not specifically said what you're going to compensate things with. So if you destroy an extremely biodiversity rich forest and you compensate it by planting a monoculture of trees and you call it a forest, it's not the same thing. But in many compensation programs, that has not been carefully thought enough about. And so you're compensating very valuable ecosystems by creating ecosystems that have considerably less value.
I follow up on that because the question is the productivity of the land taken into account in the compensations, for example, because obviously it varies. And so is that those numbers and those elements, are they taken into account?
So there, again, this meta-analysis that has been done has looked at a number of aspects of no net loss programs. And so then, for example, the UNCCD, which is the Convention on Land Degradation, has a no net loss target. And it's essentially been shown that, and that is very focused on both biodiversity, but more importantly on the functions that land provides. And again, most no net loss programs don't work. So they really, really have to be thought out well if they're going to work properly. Some do. It's not, there are some no net loss programs that work. There are reasons to believe that ZAN could work if it's done well, but it has to be done well or it won't work.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe we can take one last question from the students to the French guest, and then I'm going to try to kind of, have some kind of a, to get some paths where, towards the future and think about the similarities and differences of the two case studies, and open discussions to the floor. I have already questions that are for the Californian side as well as the French side, and maybe guests from California would be happy to ask some questions to the French side as well, or vice versa. So one last question maybe for the French side from the students, and then we're going to move forward to a broader discussion.
Yes, I have a question. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for all the presentation and the clarification regarding this very interesting project. My question is related to, I would love to learn a little bit more about at what extent is artificialization related to biodiversity loss. For example, if we take the example of like a city park, it can sometimes be more, have more biodiversity rate than like monoculture of like maize. So should we now change our criteria of biodiversity loss to better preserve it?
Who wants to answer that on the French side? Paul again.
So actually, I would hand that over to Nicolas and Kone, and Damien, but I'll try and give it a quick shot. So one of the things that Nicolas and Damien talked about was this importance of mapping land use at a much finer scale than we currently do. And it is really important to know, like you said, some urban areas, parks, but not just parks, can have high biodiversity value. And some areas that are considered non-artificialized have low biodiversity value and actually don't provide a lot of ecosystem services. And so what they were talking about is this real need to have a much better mapping of what is really happening on the ground and relate that much better to biodiversity and the ecosystem services that are provided. But perhaps they can add some.
Damien, Nicolas, you want to add something?
Oui, c'est Paul a très bien répondu.
Well, I think that Paul said everything, but just one figure. When you talk about artificialization, naturally, you need 100 years for 1 centimeter of a natural space. So it takes 100 years. And if you... then the types of agricultural practices do have an impact on the soil. We're not going to enter this debate, but it all comes down to this. If you have a natural soil, agricultural forests, as many as we have, the more we have, the better. And in this case, I'd say that this is quite a problem, because if we do want to compensate let's say a natural space, and that this space is artificialized, we need to identify another space to compensate it. But where? Because the ERC approach fails, because the compensation approach doesn't work. So the entire challenge for ZAN would be to actually renaturate artificial areas, to find a solution in order to turn it back into an actual nature state. This is a real challenge. We are aware of this. But then when it comes to the quality of the soils, this should also be taken into account.
Transversal, discussion and open to everybody. We've worked on trying to find, as I said, similarities, differences, and a way forward. So I'm just going to read very quickly what we determined in terms of similarities between the Santa Clara case studies and Paris-Saclay. Obviously, important agricultural and natural landscapes that are facing strong urbanization pressure, incentives and regulations to reduce urban sprawl, which is something we've talked about on both sides. Awareness of the value of agricultural land and natural lands, again on both sides. Implementation of policies and actions to enhance biodiversity and climate solutions. So those are the similarities. There are some differences, which is totally normal on both sides. I mean, if you look at the main drivers on the Santa Clara side, it has to do with mitigation of green gas emissions, support local food supplies, enhance biodiversity. On the Paris-Saclay side, we talked a lot about artificialization of land, support of local farmers, and community action. Policy context, there's a state, climate policy to protect working lands in California with the objective we talked about 30 by 30. And there is the ZAN and the NPAF, SPAF, I don't know how to pronounce that, a novel mechanism in France to push those, issues of artificialization. The actors are some, different on California, local land use authorities, state government, NGOs, volunteers. On the French side, farmers, local politicians, citizen group researchers, and so on and so on. I might not go all the way to the end of the list because we have a lot of things to talk about. But I just want to mention the way forward. So what's the pathway forward? We ask on both sides, and there was a common response, which was create a co-learning approach between stakeholders, researchers, and agency personnel. we've seen that through the whole discussion, the importance of having all those stakeholders working together. And also we determine, specific themes for land use and sustainability on both sides, long-term versus short-term planning, identification of priority projects, demonstration of the importance of agricultural diversification. We mentioned that, Andrea mentioned that, also Terre Cite mentioned that. And last point, understanding how researchers can work with advocacy groups and stakeholders. Louise talked, about that for a long time. So I think this is very important to see those case studies. There are differences, there are similarities, but there is a way, a path forward. And it's now time for, opening the floor to kind of broader discussion and to address, different issues on both sides. And I was wondering, maybe one of the guests from California had some questions to address to the French side, to Mrs. Doucerin, Mrs. Tissot, or French guests. Andrea, maybe you seem ready.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, they say the grass is always greener on the other side.
Yes.
So I listen to our French counterparts speaking, and I find myself very envious of the national approach, the laws, the no net loss approaches that you're speaking of, and would love to adopt them in the United States. What do you think is the one or two primary impediments to your getting success on the timelines that you've laid out?
So I guess Damien and Nicolas, is more for you in terms of the timeline and what are going to be the obstacles to that.
À mon sens, il y a deux grands obstacles.
Well, in my opinion, two main hurdles. First, political one. The timeline is very short. This law was passed in August. It will take us 2 years to update the regional policies, which is very short. Very short to update them and then to validate them, to organize consultations with the communities, with local authorities, and so on. So I would say that elected officials need to accept it, to elaborate on these documents, and this will need to be done in a very short amount of time. But also the problem of acceptance by citizens and communities. I do believe that it will be tough. It will be difficult to make sure that they understand the point of this objective. And these may constitute hurdles to the success of this objective. Well, in my opinion, there are two other obstacles. I think that our understanding will also our understanding at local level will need to be refined. At local level, we have a lot of data, but at micro level in Île-de-France region, we don't know much. So we'll need to have a much clearer understanding, a much more refined mapping. And second point, will we be able to return to a more simple way of living, a more close to nature life, sobriety? Will we be able to convince citizens that a more, let's say, a way of life with more nature in the city, sobriety in French? And it's very difficult to explain that. So if we manage to understand, how can we make sure that the average citizens will understand that the ZAN is for them, is for all of us? So the idea, the challenge here is to unify all of us and to make sure that everybody understands it.
The role of researchers, we've heard Louise talk about, what the case study she had performed and she did on the Californian side. What about on the plateau Paris-Saclay?
So it's really interesting, and Louise might want to say something about this, but there's two very different ways that research has been involved with this. In what's happening in Santa Clara Valley, a lot of that has been work that's been done outside of Santa Clara Valley and done before that they were actually putting that in place. And it's through syntheses and work that scientists have done in creating these syntheses and assessments that actually have helped the Santa Clara Valley actually come about and also help them in their implementation. In the Saclay Plateau, actually, there wasn't a lot of direct interaction with researchers, with the local actors until about a little less than a decade ago. And now there's a lot of very intense collaboration between researchers and farmers, local politicians, all the actors around the Saclay Plateau. And so we're really in a period of co-construction of research, co-conception of solutions between research and other actors. And that's different than what's going on currently in the Santa Clara Valley, at least in terms of the intensity of collaboration. So two very different ways in which research has contributed or is contributing to helping create these sustainable futures.
Louise, do you want to address that as well?
Sure. I'd like to just comment that in Yolo County, where the study was conducted, there's been a lot of action towards more climate awareness. And I think it had to do with all the workshops and public meetings and the things that Paul was just talking about are occurring around the Paris-Saclay region. And I actually had another question that I'm fascinated by for you, and that's that your program from the beginning was so driven by farmers and their interest even in forming Terre, Cite. And I'm wondering, how has their agriculture evolved even in the last 15 to 20 years? Are they very keen on this new, say, urban possibility for markets, for farm to fork, or maybe recreational type things? Is there sort of an energy building about what this whole set of actions could do for them and their operations and the longevity of their operations?
So maybe I can try and answer that as well, Fabrice.
Sure.
So when I first started working closely with actors on the Saclay Plateau, actually there were no organic farms on the Saclay Plateau, and now a substantial fraction of them are. Most of the farming was for cereal crops that were being exported outside of the Saclay Plateau, and that's changing very rapidly. So we have an organic chicken farm that's been installed. There are a number of projects, really good projects for installing vegetable farms, several of them organic vegetable farms on the Saclay Plateau. So there's really been a fundamental change in the thinking about how that should work and also how that's related to food systems. A lot of interest now in local food systems. And that's actually one of the things that we're working on, along with researchers, along with Terre City, thinking about how you go about constructing these local food supply systems that really didn't exist until a few years ago.
Thank you so much. I have we have to, we over time, we have to close, but at some point, but I have a very general question, maybe for Virginia and somebody on the French side. Somebody's asking, I think a very legitimate question is, must the protection of biodiversity be the same all over the world? So do we need to have, specific, obviously, elements and depending on the context? And so does it have to be the same? Do we have to have common grounds on everything, or can we have also our differences? Virginia, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure how we could take the same approach all over the world. We have different local contexts and different ecological circumstances. And I feel like this idea that projects should be designed by local communities and really created to suit their local needs and then supported by larger government funding is really important.
Maybe Julie, on the French side, I mean, do we have to have everything the same? Or obviously not, maybe.
Je peux répondre sur la zone de protection naturelle agricole.
I might be able to answer on the protection area. I think it's a unique tool that was a success on Paris-Saclay. It can be a good tool to implement Zen in planning of the territory. So we should first avoid to take more lands from the farms. They are very important. Artificialization, indeed, is pernicious, because even if it's on a small scale area, it can impede the farming operation or be an interface in the ecosystem. So there are qualitative aspects that have also to be taken into account, and not only the quantitative aspect. So for Paris-Saclay, we have to also implement this qualitative work. There was also a lot of construction on different croplands that were not used. We want to fight against artificialization to really target this net zero of Zen.
So many questions we could ask, but I don't think we're going to spend the evening here, the whole evening, so it's time for us to say thank you. I mean, really, thank you all our guests from all over the world. Thank you to all our listeners from all over the world, because I think there was a very vivid discussion with issues on both sides, and as I said, with also a way forward. As I said from the beginning, I'm very impressed by the fact that those two territories are trying to put their energy together to find a way forward in terms of biodiversity and all those issues. I wanted to remind you as well that we have another webinar coming on November 18th on carbon storage with very special guests as well. Valérie Masson-Delmotte from the GIEC or IPCC in English is going to be there, but also Karen Ross, Secretary of the California Department of Food and Agriculture. So that's going to be exciting as well. Again, I would say good morning or goodbye, good evening, bonjour, bonsoir. Thank you so much. Au revoir. See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.